Hey folks, what's going on? HeirofCarthage here, and I was kind of out in the woods like this weekend. I was taking my boys on their first camp out. It was a lot of fun, had a good time with them, and I didn't really do a lot of communing with the lady, as Alberic is here, but I'm going to have some other stock footage mixed in. I put a vote up on my YouTube channel and asked people what kind of video they might like to see, and out of the things that won the vote, one of the options I gave was my top 5 choices of cheap infantry in Total War Warhammer. Well, cheap infantry is pretty important. It serves as the backbone for many armies, and some factions are just better at it than others. Some factions have very few options of cheap infantry, and some factions, that's all they are, is cheap infantry. So that got me to thinking, how do you judge what the best units are in a game like Total War Warhammer 2? There are not only unit stats, which are relatively straightforward numbers, and I like numbers. We can analyze numbers, and I've actually done that. But there's more to Warhammer 2 than numbers. There are abilities, there is player skill, there is the type of engagement you're involved in, there's terrain, there is attack types. There's so many things that come into play that it really does get hard to judge. So I've decided to do something here. I'm going to tell you my favorite units just based on personal preference. But then afterwards, I'll show you a little bit of analytics. Of course, I say a little bit because, honestly, I think it's too complex to fully analyze, but the numbers are still useful to a certain extent. So to start off with, I'll go ahead and walk you through the 5 units that I picked just from a purely subjective personal preference, and sure, there's a few objective reasons that I use in that, but mostly subjective. And then I will share with you a few results from what turned out from the numbers I ran and kind of explain how I got to those numbers. So here we go. Let's jump into my favorite units. Alright, first up, number 5 is Skink Cohorts for me. Now these guys don't make the list because of their super impressive stats. You can see those here. They make the list mostly because of their speed and shield. I find them to be one of my favorite units because of how good they are at running around an enemy flank and helping to cause extra trouble with enemy cavalry, but more importantly, getting to enemy skirmishers, as you kind of see them doing here with these Empire archers. So Skink Cohorts, for me, mostly because of their versatility in being fast-moving, shielded, making them somewhat resistant to the missile fire of the units they're chasing, and then just honestly being somewhat expendable. On top of that, you may have a main force of Saurus or Temple Guards, and these guys are just really fantastic at getting around that flank and getting to the units that are going to threaten your more expensive units. So that's why Skink Cohorts, for me, come in at number 5. Now, next up for me is going to be Savage Orcs. These guys make the list, yes, a lot probably in respect to their stats. Now, for a unit of relatively cheap infantry, these guys come in with a walloping weapon strength. Now, their lack of armor makes them relatively unsurvivable, but they come in and do tremendous damage on both the charge and afterwards against unarmored units, and I find Savage Orcs to be an impressive counter to factions that really struggle with armor, or at least at the time you're fighting them, aren't putting a lot of armor on the battlefield. Savage Orcs can just be put to really good use, and they get a tremendous number of kills for the cost, the likes of which most other cheap infantry just can't claim. So these guys make the list for me because they are big hitters, and they're great at taking out your unarmored opponents. Now, number 3 on my list is High Elf Spearmen. In campaign and multiplayer, these units are quite useful. And here's why. Because of martial prowess, they pick up an extra 12 melee defense as long as their hit points are above the 50% mark, meaning you start every battle that way, and that just gives them a lot of endurance in battle that they otherwise wouldn't have. Since they also have a bonus versus large, this makes them particularly useful at holding out against more expensive monstrous infantry, monsters, or cavalry, and sometimes even lords on mounts that you will encounter in battle. Plus, in the campaign, these guys come across a lot of upgrades that make them fairly usable even pretty late into the game. Despite their somewhat lacking armor, they do have good shields, and this is a very durable unit overall, and that's why they make my list at number 3. Now, coming in at number 2 is going to be Eternal Guard. The Wood Elves don't get much by way of infantry, and fortunately for them, what little they get is actually a pretty good one. Eternal Guard are somewhat similar to their High Elf Spear brothers in terms of armor and shield, but they get the added benefit of having quite a lot of armor-piercing damage, and this makes them actually pretty effective against other infantry beyond what they should do at their weight class. Now, they do not have martial prowess because they are not a High Elf unit, so that is different, meaning they have a little less melee defense than their High Elf cousins, but these ones dish out more damage and across a wider spectrum. They are specifically anti-large, but you will find them to be quite useful against expensive armored targets. Because of that extra armor piercing they bring in, like I said, they tend to punch above their weight class, and it makes Eternal Guard a very useful unit for the Wood Elves. Number 1 on my list is Dwarf Warriors, and this is mostly because of how they play out in Grombrindal campaign. They are ridiculously OP, and I absolutely love it. If you get the benefits from Grombrindal that go to your infantry, Dwarf Warriors already have 85 armor, and then they start to get all kinds of attack and defense because of the event that pops up in that Grombrindal campaign. These guys are actually still pretty good in multiplayer as well because of the fact that they're so cheap and they offer a good shield and really solid armor. They're not going to give you a lot by way of offense, but they will certainly be trouble for factions who don't have a lot of good armor piercing. And as far as leadership goes, it's pretty high, again, for a unit of this cost. I think only an aspiring champion has a higher armor value at this cost range. When I say cost range under 600. That is higher than Dwarf Warriors, and of course aspiring champions are kind of a different animal. Well, there you have it from me. Thorgrim is officially removing my name from the Damaskron. That's only one grudge out, and many more to go. Now, jokes aside, and Thorgrim doesn't like jokes, as you can see, there's more to this discussion, so let's chat. Now, I took every infantry unit under 600 gold and entered all their statistics into a spreadsheet, so that I could put some formulas together and make some comparisons. And what I came up with was pretty interesting and also somewhat problematic. Interesting in the sense that when you do just use pure numbers, you can compare these units and you can come up with some interesting statistics, and that is what I'm going to share with you. However, yes, timed with that Banshee scream, there is a bit of a deeper challenge here, and that is the fact that abilities in and of themselves can really change how a unit behaves, such as martial prowess, murderous prowess, disintegrating, crumbling, scare, terror, vanguard deployment, poison attacks, magic attacks, missile attacks like blasting charges. There are many things that can change how a cheap infantry unit is going to behave. Now, what I put together was this. There is one section called Combat Score. In the Combat Score, I took all the way from the max to the minimum values of all of the different statistics like health, melee attack, leadership, all these things, and put it together and came up with a score for each unit based off of how it compares to the highest value from all of its peers. Let me give you an example. If the highest melee attack of all the units under 600 gold was 36, then every unit received a score as a percentage of what its melee attack was of 36. So if that unit had 36 melee attack, it would receive a 100% score for the melee attack category. I did this through each and every different aspect of the statistics and came up with a score that I called Combat Score. And I'm going to go through some of the results of the Combat Score. And here are the numbers I came up with. So if you ignore cost, which is the first look, I do take cost into the second look here, aspiring champions are going to be number 1. And it's really kind of an odd one though, because they only have 12 unit models on large scale, but if you take it for what it is, aspiring champions are far and away the winners when you just look at all the statistics. But if you kind of move down the pack, you can see Dryads, Norskin Marauders, Chaos Marauders, Gore Herds, and Savage Orcs all coming in at around the same place. And this makes a lot of sense. All those units are at roughly the same value, so this wasn't too terribly shocking. But obviously we can't ignore cost, and so here it is. When I determine these same scores, but then take it on a per cost basis, here is what the list comes up with. So peasant mob at number 1. Now, this isn't terribly surprising. We've had some how many peasant episodes in the past, and the peasants actually tend to usually hold out for what they're worth. Now, obviously, you can't afford to have 40 of them in a stack, but these guys actually are decent for their cost. And you can see, not surprisingly again, far behind them, Skaven slaves, zombies, Skaven slave spears, and men-at-arms. All these units are actually pretty good considering the cost you get, and I don't think any of this is a terrible surprise to anybody who is a campaign or multiplayer player in Total War Warhammer 2 with a decent bit of experience. Cheap doesn't always mean bad. These cheap units can absorb charges, they can provide value in lots of ways, and most of them also come with the expendable trait, meaning that your standard units don't suffer a leadership debuff when they see these guys routing, because their entire purpose on the battlefield was to act as a meat shield. Anyway, there you have it. That is my top 5 list, along with a list actually driven by numbers. But I think I gave you all a warning earlier on that numbers aren't the whole story here. It is difficult to take into account abilities. I kind of did it by count of abilities, but there's more to abilities than the number of abilities a unit has, and so I kind of decided to throw that out. What do you all think? What is your list? Put that down in the comments for me. I want to see what you think. Hope you all enjoyed this. HeirofCarthage signing out for now, and I will see you soon with some more Total War Warhammer 2 content.